Jessica, it's all yours.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sylvia and Nina. So I'm just going to share my screen real quick so that we can get started. So yeah, welcome. We're going to be talking about vermicomposting today. And I am curious how many people have tried vermicomposting, or this is their first time even hearing about it. So maybe I don't know if there is actually a chat, but if there is a chat, maybe you could type in yeah, your experience with vermicomposting, how much you know about it or don't know about it. Okay, and so the goal for the end of the presentation is that you'll feel pretty comfortable and even maybe comfortable enough to start your own vermicomposter if you're ready for that. Okay. Okay, so first thing I always do is I just want to ask about any access needs. Okay, so access needs would be just anything that would prevent you from being able to participate in the presentation. So if I'm speaking too quickly and you need me to slow down, or if I'm not loud enough, if you need something repeated, anything like that, feel free to chime in and let me know. I want to make sure that everyone is able to participate. Okay. And even though we're, joining each other virtually right now, I still want to do a quick acknowledgement of where we are situated right now. If everyone is in Vaughan, I'm right now in Aurora, and it's all the same traditional territories within York Region. So we're situated on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And one thing that I like to share with folks, because when we do a land acknowledgement, we oftentimes it feels like that's sort of the end of that. But I always say when we're introducing ourselves to someone new, getting to know them, we can shake their hand, we can ask for their name, but if we don't go further than that, we don't actually know them, right? So in terms of really trying to explore and understand our relationship to the histories of this land, I have some questions that I always ask myself, and I like to share that with people in case that's helpful. Oh, we have someone from California. That's great. Welcome, Grace. Awesome. So I was just reading the chats. That's great. No problem if you've never heard of vermicomposting. We're going to get all into that for sure. And so these questions that I want to share just help us to kind of think about our relationship to land. And we're talking about compost today. So there's a huge connection there, right? Compost is part of the land. And what we're trying to do is take care of the land by creating this compost, by diverting things from the landfill. So these are important questions and they're relevant. So some things I want you to think about with me are what's our relationship, what's our parents' relationship, or our family, our ancestors, our culture's relationship to land. Did we have ancestors who used to farm or who used to, explore the land? How do our parents relate to the land? And also, what is the history of that land, right? So there's lots of history to York Region and what went on there. And it's so important to really dive into that, right? Not just the pretty parts of our history, but also the really, the heavier parts to be able to acknowledge that colonization and the process and what that's brought to the land as well, and the people that were here. And then a question I like to put out there is, how do I relate to the land right now? So am I going out there and I'm kind of scared to be outside? I don't like touching the soil, or is it something that's really soothing to me? Do I like looking at flowers? Am I scared of the bees? Even just asking yourself questions like this, there's no wrong answers, but it helps you to be a bit more aware, right, of how we actually relate. And maybe there's something that we want to shift in that relationship. And so that brings us to our next question of what does it mean to respect the land? So, what are we doing and how are we thinking of the land each day? And is there respect in that connection and interaction? And then lastly, we are all treaty people. So we're on Williams Treaty territory. if you're in York Region. And so, you know, it's a really important question to say, what does that actually mean to be on Williams Treaty territory? What did the treaties outline? And what does it mean for me as someone who is a treaty person? What are my responsibilities? Okay, so just sharing some of those questions. I hope that's helpful for people as well, and just to sort of start some, you know, thinking around all of this. But like I said, we are talking about the land when we're talking about composting. And, you know, why are we thinking about composting? What's the benefit there? So I've laid out some key benefits. One big thing is, you know, we experience some extreme heat waves out there. And even though it's raining for the next few days, sometimes we're going through things like drought, and we're not able to you know, keep up with the watering and all of that, or we just don't have enough water around us. And so when we're composting, we're actually putting organic matter into the ground. And organic matter is something that really helps to retain moisture. So you'll find if you have a lot of organic matter in your soil, you won't have to water as much and as often because of the water retention abilities of organic matter. Another thing is there's lots of beneficial microorganisms. So we're talking about teeny tiny things that we can only see through microscopes, your bacteria, your fungi, your actinomycetes, all of these things that are actually very beneficial to our plants and to our soils. They all appear in compost. And so we're not just putting some sort of dead material onto our plants or into the garden, we're actually putting live organisms that actually help to create this micro ecosystem. And of course, we know composting, there's rich nutrients in compost, all the things that we need for our plants to grow nice and healthy. So that's already a common knowledge. And if we're putting food scraps in our composter, we are diverting it from going into the landfill, where it actually creates harmful gases like methane that creates more, you know, negative climate change happening. So that's one big reason that we should be all composting. Okay. And also, when you have healthy plants, when you have healthy soil, you have healthy plants. And when you have healthy plants, it's better able to actually fight off any pest issues or diseases. Just like human beings, if we're healthy, we can fight off a cold much more easily than if we weren't, you know, feeling our best. So this is another big benefit to our gardens. Compost also helps to regulate the acidity and the alkaline levels in our soils. And lastly, it's really accessible and affordable. So we can easily, if we're all, you know, eating and cooking and having kitchen scraps, it's free, right? We don't actually have to pay a lot of money. We don't have to go out to the stores to buy fertilizer. We have everything that we need in order to, you know, benefit the soil. So here actually is a video from YouTube. So I hope you can see the movement in there, but this is under a microscope, and you can see all of the microorganisms within, this is soil and compost. So it's alive. It's not, you know, a dead thing. And so that's what we're trying to put into our soils. So what do you see here? There are lots of things like fungi and bacteria, your actinomycetes, and there's, you can see the amount listed below here of, you know, 100,000 to 100 million actinomycetes per gram of compost. Same thing with our fungi, 10,000 to 1 million, or bacteria, which is the most common, 100 million to 1 billion. So we have a lot of life within our compost that is very beneficial to our plants. So I get this question a lot, you know, can I go outside and just grab some earthworms when it's raining? You know, they're all on the sidewalk. Can I just grab them and then put them in my vermicompost bin, and then that's that? So the answer is no. And the reason is there's different types of worms, right? So our earthworms outside, they actually don't do well in a vermicompost bin. And I'm just going to show you really quickly. I want to make sure that let's see. So I've got a vermicompost bin here, just as an example. Okay, so it's just kind of like one of those Rubbermaid bins. All right. This one is a 10-gallon one, pretty standard. But as you can see, there's not that much space in there, and it's not that deep. Now, earthworms outside, they love burrowing deep. And that's why they can even sometimes survive the winters. They get really, really, really far down into the soil, and they can sort of regulate their temperatures that way. Okay. Whereas the vermicompost worms we want inside of our vermicompost bins, they stay closer to the surface. So that works well with a small bin like this indoors, where they don't feel like they're, you know, trapped on the surface. They're actually happy there. Okay, so these worms are called red wigglers. All right, that's the most common one that you would find for vermicomposting. They're much smaller, so usually they're maybe like half a finger length, whereas you've seen earthworms that are, you know, maybe like the size of your hand. So they're very different in size. The red wigglers also withstand higher temperatures. Okay, so that's good, because we're putting a lot of decaying matter in there, and that creates some heat. And so they're totally fine with that, and they love eating that food, those food scraps, the kitchen scraps, and the decaying matter. Okay. And also they reproduce really quickly, which is what we want. We want a nice, healthy, big population of worms inside our bin. And these red wigglers aren't usually found outside here in Ontario. They're not, oops, there we go. Whereas obviously our earthworms are outside, and they're very sensitive to high temperatures, the earthworms outside. Okay, so they're not quite as happy in these bins. They'll eat organic matter, but only if it's broken down to a very small degree. And so if we put our kitchen scraps in there, they're not quite as keen to break that stuff down. They need other things to break it down first before they'll actually eat that. Okay, so just emphasizing that again, we're not going to go outside, bring those earthworms in and put them in our bins, and neither are we going to take these red wigglers that we get for our vermicompost bins and bring them outside into our outdoor composters. Okay, those two things don't mix. Those red wigglers, you'll be wasting your money. They would die over the winter. They wouldn't be very happy out there, and they don't do as much for you out there. We want to make sure we put them in the right setting. All right, so here's a quick poll. So if you want to type in your chat what your guess is, how many hearts does a worm have? And I think there's as kids, we were always like, oh, worms have like 10 hearts. Is that right? Let's see what you guys think in the chat. I'll give you a second. Yeah. Okay, we got a 10, we got a 5, 5. Nice. All right. Oh, 8, 5. Okay, good stuff. So I think we had 2 people who said 5, and that is actually the correct answer. So yeah, worms have 5 hearts, but they are all located close to the head. Okay, so I don't ever recommend cutting a worm in half. You know, we don't want to be hurting them. But I know there was sort of like an urban myth out there of like, oh, if you cut a worm in half, then you get 2 worms. But that's not actually true. You have 1 worm that's really hurt. It's 1/2 would still be alive because it has the 5 hearts within that section. But you're doing nothing by cutting a worm in half. So please don't do that. But yeah, the more you know, right? The 5 hearts located close to the head. The other thing that I want to share with you guys, some fun worm facts. Worms don't have teeth, okay? So how do they actually break down food? They actually use, grit, like sand and maybe like broken down eggshells and bits of the soil to grind that food inside in the gizzard is what we call it. And so that's why we do need maybe sometimes some fine eggshells to go in there when we first start our bin, so that they have something to be able to actually break down the food with. Now, worms actually breathe through their skin. And so this tells us a lot about how to keep their environment. If it's too dry in the vermicompost bin, it actually, it's a bit, they don't have enough mucus. It dries out that mucus. And so that actually prevents them from, that actually dries out their skin. If it's too wet, they actually can't breathe, right? Because they'll kind of drown. And that's why you see a lot of times when it rains outside, the earthworms are coming up and onto the sidewalk to get away from too much moisture. They can't breathe if there is. Now, if there's too much oil or fat in the bin, it'll actually coat the skin, right? And they can't breathe through that. And so that's one of the reasons we don't want to be putting oily foods into our compost bin. But I'll talk a bit more about that in a little bit. Worms are amazing in that they can double their population every 3 months. So if you get, a vermicompost bin with 1 pound of worms, in 3 months, you might have 2 pounds in there. Now, with the limited amount of food and space in there, they'll actually self-regulate and they'll kind of land at a good population for the size of the space. But given, an infinite amount of space, they would double every 3 months. And they actually eat half their weight in food each day. So that's incredible. So that also helps us figure out how much to feed them, okay, every week or every 2 weeks. Now, in terms of their lifespan, without predators, in the perfect conditions and everything, they can live up to 10 years. So that's pretty amazing. And I just wanted to share this cool image here with you guys. So these are actually worm eggs. So you can see on the fingertip there's 2 eggs. And I believe that it starts off quite light, and then the darker it gets, the closer it gets towards, hatching, essentially. All right, so if you do have a vermicompost bin or you start one and you see these, you're like, what are those? They're just eggs, and they're great to have. It's a good sign that you have a healthy vermicompost bin. All right, so nitty-gritties of what you should put in your bin and what you shouldn't. Like I said, if you put something too acidic, the worms don't like that. It's they actually move away from that, and so we want to avoid citrus fruits. Okay, your oranges, your tangerines, your lemons, that kind of thing. We also don't want to be putting our meats and fish in there. Not only because it's oily and it can coat their skin, but also you get really bad odors. It's hard to maintain sort of like the health and safety of the soil. You might get some pathogens in there that you don't want to be putting out into your garden. Okay, so we avoid that. Same thing with the fats and oils, like your butters and cooked foods that are heavily saturated in oils. We want to avoid that. Our vinegars are also acidic, so we don't want to be putting things like that in there. And then worms don't like your spicy things, okay? So your peppers, like your hot peppers, and even garlic and onions, that kind of thing. It's very aromatic. They kind of veer away from that. And lastly, dairy. Dairy has a lot of fats and oils in it, and it's likely to go bad in there. So we don't want to be putting cheese and that kind of thing in there. Now, the things that we are good to put in, any non-citrus fruits, they love melon rinds and banana peels, really any type of vegetable scrap that you don't use in your cooking in the kitchen. You can put tea leaves in there, you can put coffee grounds in there. Some people are always ask me, well, coffee is acidic, so is it actually okay to put in there? So it's okay to put coffee grounds that have already been run through, you've made your coffee and it's the coffee grounds that are left over from that, because waters run through and a lot of the acidity actually just goes into your cup of coffee. It leaves the bean or the grind behind, and it's safe to put in. Eggshells, I would usually grind them up really fine as much as possible. So even if you can put it in a food processor, that would be great. It takes quite a while to break down, but it's good for the worms. So usually I put some in the beginning and then I won't keep adding them because otherwise you're going to get too much eggshells. And then the last thing is any type of bedding, and that is essentially any shredded paper, shredded newspaper, shredded cardboard. I try not to bring outdoor items into the bin just because it's harder to control. And so things like shredded leaves and wood chips, I avoid generally bringing in. It doesn't mean that it can't go in, but I just worry that sometimes I'll bring external, insects and other things that we might not want in the bins. So if you have an office, you can always ask them, do you guys have shredded paper for me? All right, so just going over a few different types of composters. So this one on the right-hand side, that's essentially what I have on the table with me. And that's what we usually use. So really, it's just a Rubbermaid container. The 10-gallon ones are perfect in my opinion. We drill a hole in the top of the lid. And sometimes people will drill some holes on the top side of the bin. And that's to give them some oxygen, right? We want them to have oxygen so they can breathe. And we want the compost to have oxygen so it doesn't become anaerobic and sort of moldy and there are pathogens in there. So that's the simplest type in my opinion. There are other things like you see the middle there. That's a neat little design where it doubles as a stool and it's kind of nice looking, so you can keep it in your house and people aren't like, oh, why do you have, bins lying around? So this one has multi-levels, okay? And then I believe there's usually some sort of drainage at the bottom if you need. And so that's a good option if you want it to, look good in your home. For our Rubbermaid containers, usually we just put it on like a shelf or under the sink in the basement. They don't really take up that much space. And then there's also worm towers like this, not so much aesthetically pleasing, but they sort of use that stacking method to in their design. Okay. Okay, so how many worms to start with? That really depends on how much kitchen waste you produce. So again, worms will eat half their weight in food per day, right? So if you weigh the average amount of food scraps that comes out of your kitchen each day from what you cook, you can start by doubling that amount in worms, right? So if you create about half a pound of food waste per day, you can start with a pound of worms. That makes sense. Generally, I find that actually a pound of worms is the most efficient minimum amount for a Rubbermaid container like ours. Okay. Now, what is the ideal temperature for worms? They will not do well outside because of the temperature fluctuation. So ideally between 12 to 24 degrees Celsius is perfect for them. They can survive between 5 to 30 degrees, but if it's too cold, the worms will start to slow down in terms of feeding and also reproduction. So you might find that there's not as much breakdown of the food and the population isn't quite as robust as you'd want it. Now, if it's too hot, the worms will try to start to climb up the sides, trying to find cooler areas. I've never had worms come out of the bin. Usually they can't find their way out of the bin, and they don't really want to. They don't like open air light. They want to be sort of in a dark, moist area. And so they don't generally come out of the bin, but sometimes I see them climbing the sides and sort of hanging out in the sides. And that's because they're either too hot or they're not happy. Something's keeping them from actually being inside of the bin in the materials. And so I always say, keep your bin indoors. You can tuck it away somewhere, you know, relatively dark, and sort of at a pretty regular temperature. So not somewhere that would, again, fluctuate. So even garages, I find, are not super ideal. Like you probably could, but it might stress the worms out a little bit. Okay. I'm just going to check the chat. Okay, so thank you so much. I think Sylvia or Nina has put in the Fahrenheit translation of our Celsius. So I'm just going to play this video for you. So this is just us building a box, a fresh and new box. Essentially, you start off with your bedding material. In this case, it's shredded paper. And you can see it looks like a lot, but as soon as you add moisture to that, add the water, it really, really shrinks down. It's like cooking your spinach, right? It really shrinks down to nothing. And so the next step you want to do is add lots of water until the bedding is like a wrung out sponge is essentially what we say. Okay. So if you add water and it seems to really, really reduce, you want to add more bedding until it seems like, usually I say a good, maybe at least 1.5 inches, if not 2 inches of bedding. Okay. So keep adding your bedding if you find that it's shrinking down. And then once you've got the right amount and the right moisture level, you want to put the worms in. Okay. If you put them on top, they'll find their way in. They'll start to go down because they don't like being exposed. Or you can sort of move beside the bedding and place the worms at the bottom and then put the bedding back over them. All right. Sometimes I like to include some what we call worm castings. So the materials that were in that are finished. I like to put a handful of that into a new bin. So then it just helps to kickstart that new bin. Because there's lots of microbes and microorganisms, and even just some moisture retention abilities. Okay, so if you're creating a new bin out of from an old bin, or you have an old bin, you can use some of the vermicompost castings. And then the last thing is you add some kitchen scraps. So I'll tell you a little bit more about how I do that in a future slide. But essentially, you want to add the kitchen scraps, check back maybe in a week, see if the food is gone. If it is, that means you can definitely feed them again. If it hasn't gone yet, it's still there, then give them a bit more time to break that down. So eventually you kind of get a feel of how often to feed and how much to add each time. Okay, and certainly when I check each time, I'll look at the moisture level. If it feels like it's a bit too dry, then I'll add a little bit of water in there. If it feels like it's a bit too wet, then I might add more shredded paper so it soaks it up a little bit. Okay. All right, so food preparation. So you can definitely add kitchen scraps as is. So sometimes people will just put a banana peel as is, and eventually it'll break down, but it'll take a little bit of time. And I find that if you just add it as is, sometimes there's fruit fly issues or it gets moldy in there, which is not the end of the world. Your bin will still function, but no one wants fruit flies in their home, right? So what I do is I like to break down the food before putting it in, because worms aren't going to cut up food. They're going to wait until that food is really mushy and kind of more broken down by a lot of the microbes before they start to eat it, right? So we want to speed up that process. So I'll either put something through a food processor or a blender. It's a lot more work because you have to kind of wash it every time, right? The blender. Or I'll take scissors and I'll just cut the pieces into smaller sizes. Okay. Or you can even, get a cutting board and a kitchen knife and just chop up whatever you have for them. But I try to make it as small as possible, and then I'll feed them. Now, if you do have any issues with fruit flies, you can actually microwave the pieces for about 30 seconds. That helps to kill off any of the eggs that are still on the skin of the fruit and the vegetables. It sounds gross, but they actually just sometimes come with the eggs, right? But we often cook it or we just eat it so quickly that it's not a big deal. But if we actually help it along by microwaving 30 seconds or freezing it and letting it freeze fully before thawing and then feeding it to them, that can greatly help to reduce the fruit fly issues by killing off the eggs. Okay. And when I feed, usually I just push some bedding aside along the outer wall. I'll place the like a handful of the food in there, and then I'll cover that back up. And usually I just feed along the outer walls. And I just find that really helps sort of regulate the temperature and the moisture within the bin. I'll kind of rotate where I feed each time. It's, these are all technicalities, so I really do encourage you not to get intimidated. Once you start your bin, you'll kind of find a rhythm and figure out what works best for your bin. Now, in terms of troubleshooting some common problems and solutions, if your bin should not smell bad. So if you're getting a really strong odor from your bin, that means something's wrong. That means you should change something, okay? And oftentimes it just means it's too wet. Maybe you're putting in too much food that the worms can't break down in time. Okay, and so you start to get the odors, the mold, and the flies and all of that. So maybe reduce the amount of food you put in there, and also maybe try and put in a few more of the bedding materials so that it can soak up some of the moisture. Okay. Now, you actually that there's moisture pooling at the bottom of your bin, you can find that the moisture is gathering in one corner, and you can actually put some newspaper there, let it soak it up, and then throw out the newspaper, or you can shred it up, or you can take a turkey baster and sort of get rid of some of that excess moisture. A lot of times I find I just put extra bedding in there, mix it up a little bit, and that helps to solve the problem. Now, if sometimes you open it up and you see really large lumps, oftentimes it just means it's too dry. So maybe we'll sprinkle in some water. I like to use a spatula because it's nice and soft and doesn't hurt the worms. But you can take a spatula that you designate for your worm bin, okay? Don't put it back in the kitchen, but take that spatula and kind of break up the lumps a little bit, nice and gentle, and that should help. Now, again, like I said, if there are worms crawling up the sides of the bin, it means something in the environment is not ideal for them. So either it's too wet and they need to breathe, they need to find somewhere drier, or maybe it's too acidic, or there's foods in there that they, don't like if it's spicy, that might be hurting them, right? So they might try and leave that space and climb up and hang out on the sides. So if you notice that, try and, pinpoint what the issue is and fix that. And then we did go over the fruit fly issue. So again, just make sure that it's the right amount of food, and you can try the microwaving or freezing method to see if that helps. All right, so in terms of harvesting, what do you do with the castings? We call it castings, which is essentially worm poop. What do you do with that? How do you get that out of the bin without getting rid of all your worms? So what I do is 1 to 2 months before I plan to harvest, if it feels like we have enough castings, then I'll stop feeding the worms. So worms can survive at least 2 weeks without food and many weeks without feeding. What I mean by that is oftentimes there's still food in there for them. If you still see some bedding, if you still see some, kitchen scraps, if you stop feeding them, even for a month, they'll just continue to break down the final scraps in there And then that way we're not harvesting actual food, okay? And so give them that time to break the rest of the stuff down, and then we can actually do the harvesting process. So in harvesting, we want to keep the worms so that we can create a new bin. We want to take and separate the castings so we can use that in our garden with our seedlings. And so how do we do that? The method I use is the slowest method, in my opinion, but it happens all at once. So essentially it's called dump and sort. Basically, I take a big handful of the material and I put it on the table in almost like a pyramid shape, okay? And then I wait maybe 5 minutes because the worms don't like being exposed. They'll start going to the bottom and center of that pyramid pile. And after 5 minutes, I'll scoop off the top. If I see any worms in there, I'll kind of, put them into a pile. And now I've got a handful of castings that doesn't have any worms in it. So I'll put that in whatever container I want, okay? And then I'll wait another, 2 to 3 minutes, let the worms continue to go down, and I'll do it again. I'll scoop the top part of that that doesn't have any worms anymore. So you can see it takes a little bit of time, but sometimes you can throw on a TV show or, have a friend come over and help you and just chat with them. And it's a pretty, low-key, enjoyable process, in my opinion. Okay. And really towards the end, you kind of just have a pile of worms. So you can make sure those go into the next bin or container that you're going to be using. Okay, that makes sense. And this is just a video of us doing it in fast forward. Okay, so it's sped up and you can see there's multiple piles. Eventually I get my friend in here to help me and we kind of just chat until we're done with the whole thing. Okay, so you can kind of see in the video the worms wriggling their way down each time we scoop up the top part. Okay. Let's see, how do I exit this? Oops. Okay. The other method that you could try is the side-to-side harvesting. Essentially, it's forcing the worms to migrate horizontally. So you do that by feeding only one side of the bin. Okay, so you have all the food scraps on one side. The worms tend to migrate over there. You leave that for maybe a week or so that they can find their way over, and then you can harvest the castings on the other side, which shouldn't have too many worms. I find that worms will still kind of hang out on that side once they've already fed and they're happy. So you still kind of have to pick out some worms from the other side, but it sort of helps to really get most of them on the other, where the food is. And then you can take those and create a new bin. There's also a vertical or multi-level harvesting. Okay, so if you have a Rubbermaid container, what you can do is you can take another one that's completely empty and drill holes at the bottom. Okay, now you take that, you put maybe a little bit of bedding in there, some food scraps in that top bin, the one with the holes in it, and then I place that right on top of inside of our current bin. And we want to make sure that the bottom of that top bin touches the material inside the vermicompost bin. Okay, so the idea is the worms will be able to sense the food above and they start to go up into the upper bin. All right, again, they don't like to go burrow deep. They like to go more shallow. So they'll go up and follow the food. Eventually, after maybe a few weeks, you can take that top bin and most of your worms will be there. And what you're left with is beautiful, clear scrap castings in the bottom bin. Okay. So this is just to showcase what finished worm castings look like. And if you could smell that right now, it would just smell like earth. It wouldn't be, smelly. It wouldn't be like food scraps or anything. It would just be beautiful, smells like beautiful earth outside. Okay, and that stuff is packed with your nutrients, packed with microbes. It's perfect for so many of your plants outside. I've seen, this is actually from Evergreen Brickworks in Toronto, and this is what they have. This is less so to get the worms out per se, but it's more to sort through larger materials versus the fine worm castings. And then they'll put the larger materials back into a vermicomposter to break down further. So it's sort of like a sifting mechanism. So it's essentially, they built it out of like the ends of a bucket and some mesh, and they've got a handle where they can rotate that, and then a bin underneath to catch everything that falls through the mesh. So a question I always get is, where do you get worms? Well, you can order them online. There are a few local companies. So there's Kathy's Crawley Composters. She's in Bradford, and she will sell red wigglers. She also sells that stool vermicomposter that I was showing you guys. And she's got a whole bunch of other things, and she does workshops. She's a wealth of knowledge. So that's this second last link here. There's also one in Ontario called Urban Worm Company. You can check them out. I know Evergreen Brickworks used to have a volunteer vermicompost program called the Worm Wranglers, and I love that name. I don't know if they're still functioning, but I remember, doing a quick tour of their facility, and they shared worms with me back then. So if they're still happening, that's a great resource. So I was asked a question, what kind of worm do I have? I have the red wigglers. I find them to be the most effective ones. Okay. Now we do actually run our own vermicompost system. We've got 3 bins, and we're trying to currently build up our population again. But once we have enough, we're happy to share some worms with community members. Okay. So if you're local to us, you can always email me to let me know that you're interested. And once we have enough worms, I can let you know, and then I can share a good amount with you so you can start your own bin. Okay, it's just right now we're kind of still waiting for the population to get back up again, but definitely stay connected. Okay. All right, so that's mainly the end of the actual information. I just wanted to get a sense. How do you guys feel now after the workshop? Do you feel very confident that you can start your own bin, or even if you already have your own bin, you're kind of confident, you think you might need some more information, or you're just not confident at all? I just want to kind of get a sense of, whether the information was helpful for you guys to start. So feel free to pop that in the chat, how you feel right now after the presentation about vermicomposting. And here's some helpful links and resources. So I can actually share this with Nina, and I don't know if Nina, you're able to share that with the rest of the group, but if so, I'll definitely send those over. Okay. I'm loving reading these comments. You guys are feeling confident to try it. That's awesome. So just to let you know a little bit about who we are, York Region Food Network, we are an organization, a nonprofit, so we work towards food security. So that can look like an urban agriculture program, which I help to run. We have kitchen programs, we have drop-in breakfasts, a good food program. We also work on policy in terms of food insecurity. How can we change it at a much more systemic level? So just since you guys are with Vaughan Public Libraries, I want to let you guys know about a few community gardens we have in the area. Because if you're interested in vermicomposting, you're probably interested in growing your own food, and what better place to do that than at a community garden. So we have our Growing to Give community garden. It's a collective garden where everyone works together on the entire space, and it's actually located at 835 Clark Avenue. So that's Clark and Bathurst. It's behind the fire hall, actually. So if you're interested in signing up for any of these gardens, feel free to send me an email or go on our website, and there's a link there where you can sign up to be on the email list. We also have a community garden at Vaughan City Hall, okay, 2141 Major Mackenzie, and that's also a collective garden where everyone works together. And then lastly, we have our compost learning hub. So this one is at 145 Lubavitch Campus Drive. And this is more of a demonstration garden where we really showcase different compost styles, different ways to grow sustainably. So how do we harvest rainwater? We have rain barrels there. What are native plants that are good to have in your garden? All sorts of environmental and earth-based workshops and education we do there. Okay, so if you're interested in volunteering there, again, feel free to sign up on our website or send me an email. Okay, so here's my information if you did want to write that down.